All right, boys and girls, let's talk about human rights. So, human rights theorists are people who think about moral problems in terms of respect for human rights. The UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which lists rights such as the right to privacy, the right to an education, the right to work, the right to health care, represents a kind of international consensus of all of the countries that signed on to this declaration about what rights exist. Of course, those countries don't always, or maybe don't ever, respect the rights that are listed in this document, but the document seems to suggest, at least in principle, that there's a kind of international agreement about what rights are real. Why would somebody think about moral problems in terms of human rights? Well, I think there are a few reasons. One reason is that rights talk and thinking about moral problems in terms of human rights has a good historical track record. A lot of the great social progress of the 20th century, voting rights progress, the civil rights movement, national rights to sovereignty that were invoked in the fight against European colonial powers. A lot of the great advancements and achievements of the last 150 years have sort of revolved around the idea and the rhetoric of rights. Okay, so rights have a pretty good track record, at least in that respect, or at least if we're sticking to those examples. When we frame things in terms of rights, it keeps discussion sort of positive and focused on what people value and what people care about. It's nice to say, let's protect one another's right to free speech. It's not as nice, or it's a little bit more censorious or finger wagging or negative to say, don't tell people what to say. Keep your mouth shut, that kind of thing. Okay. Lastly, in the last video, I considered a couple of objections to utilitarianism, and human rights theories respond to those objections. So if you're a person who thinks, for example, that it's not a good idea to sacrifice the interests of a small minority for the greater good, maybe you could appeal to the rights of that minority to give you a kind of moral framework for that can respond to utilitarianism and defend this intuition, defend this belief in that we should never sacrifice the individual for the greater good. Okay. That said, there are some objections to thinking about human rights, to human rights theory, to thinking about moral problems in terms of human rights, which I'd like to get into briefly. First, it's not clear how to decide whether some right is real. Of course, the UN Universal Declaration represents some kind of international consensus, but then again, if you read it pretty closely, you can see that a kind of Western, liberal, European voice is speaking there. Why should Western, European, American liberals get to tell the rest of the world what rights are real and what aren't? And furthermore, if the answer to the question, what rights are real, just comes from utilitarianism, and you say, well, the rights are real that are important to securing people's happiness, then it seems like human rights theory just collapses into, or becomes another way of stating, utilitarianism after all. Okay, so there's one problem for human rights theory, which is that it's not clear what rights exist and how you can justify a claim that some right or other exists. Another problem with human rights theory is that it's hard to apply, not just because our sort of knowledge is limited, the way that it is with utilitarianism, where we might have a hard time estimating the likely consequences of our actions, but it's hard to apply sort of in principle or conceptually. After all, as I pointed out in the reading, rights are limited, they come into conflict, and they create different obligations for different groups of people and different institutions. So, if your right to free speech, or excuse me, if your right to an education comes into conflict with someone's right to bear arms, say because you don't want to go to a school where people are carrying guns around, Well, which right is going to give? Do we say the person shouldn't take guns into school, or do we say that the person should go to school somewhere else or not get an education at all? You might have an answer to that, but it's not clear where that answer comes from within sort of the theory of human rights. Or again, we usually think of freedom of speech as protecting your speech from government interference. So, the cops and Bill de Blasio and Donald Trump can't tell you what to say or think. But our lives are governed by our employers in much the same way that they're governed by the state. So, does your right to free speech also protect your speech from interference from your employer? Well, who knows? How do you make up your mind? And until you can answer these sorts of questions, until you have an account of exactly what obligations rights create for what groups, and exactly what you need to do to figure out what the limits of our rights are, and what to do when rights come into conflict, rights aren't going to give you very much guidance about what to do in tricky moral situations. After all, tricky moral situations are usually tricky in part because they, at least plausibly or on the surface, involve a competition between different sorts of rights, or at least different sorts of claims that people can make. And we have to figure out how to navigate between those different conflicts. Okay. So if the whole point of a moral theory is to give us some guidance about what to do in tricky moral situations, and rights theories give out in tricky moral situations, that might mean that rights theories aren't very good at doing what we want moral theories to do. Oh, I was supposed to use the objection owl again. Well, there you go.